Richard Vance pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the wrought iron gates, his face a mask of smug authority. "I think it's time for you and your son to leave," he said, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty of a man who had never been told no. "People like you simply don't belong here." David Harris looked at the man, then at his 10-year-old son, Leo, whose bright eyes were now clouded with confusion and hurt. He had endured their condescending remarks, their thinly veiled insults, and their suffocating arrogance all afternoon. But this public dismissal in front of his child was a line crossed. Richard and his wife, Eleanor, stood on the manicured lawn of the Oakwood Reserve Country Club, a place they considered their personal kingdom, confident in their unassailable position. They thought they were asserting their dominance over a man who had dared to breach their gilded walls. They didn't know that every condescending word, every dismissive gesture was directed at the one man who held their precious status, this club, and their entire world of appearances in the palm of his hand. Within 24 hours, their kingdom would have a new king, and they would be forced to kneel. Have you ever been judged by your appearance, by the car you drive, or by the color of your skin? It's a feeling that stings, a quiet injustice that many of us have faced. We have a story for you today that I think you'll find incredibly satisfying. So tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. We love seeing how far our stories travel. And if you believe that true worth lies in character, not in status, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. The day had begun with the innocent, bubbling excitement of a child. "Are we really going, Dad?" Leo had asked, bouncing on the balls of his feet as David packed a small bag with sunscreen, towels, and a couple of books. Leo's new friend, Ethan Vance, had invited him for a day of swimming at his parents' country club. It was a big deal for a 10-year-old, an entry into a world of sprawling green lawns, a shimmering blue pool, and endless ice cream. David, an architect who valued clean lines and quiet integrity over ostentatious displays, had his reservations. He knew of Oakwood Reserve by reputation, old money, older prejudices, and a membership roster that was as exclusive as it was homogeneous. But the pure, unadulterated joy on his son's face was a force he couldn't resist. "We're really going," David had confirmed, ruffling Leo's hair. "Let's go have some fun." His modest, impeccably maintained sedan, a stark contrast to the gleaming parade of German luxury cars that lined the circular driveway, was the first thing to draw a sneer. As he pulled into a visitor's spot, he saw Eleanor Vance standing near the entrance, her designer sunglasses perched on her nose like a sentinel. She watched his approach, her lips tightening into a thin, disapproving line. "Ethan's guest, I presume," she'd said, her voice cool and distant. It wasn't a question so much as an accusation. "That's right," David replied with a warm, easy smile that received no welcome. "I'm David Harris, Leo's father. It's a pleasure to meet you." Eleanor's eyes flickered over his simple linen shirt and tailored chinos, then to his car and back again. The appraisal was swift and dismissive. "Richard and I are by the pool," she stated, already turning away. "Ethan is waiting." There was no welcome, no offer to show them the way, just an expectation that they would follow like servants. As David and Leo walked behind her, David felt the familiar weight of being assessed and found wanting based on a superficial checklist he had no interest in completing. He could feel the eyes of other members on him, a black man in a sea of placid white faces, his presence an anomaly they couldn't quite compute. He squeezed Leo's shoulder gently, a silent reassurance that they were in this together. He knew this world. He had designed buildings for men and women exactly like the Vances. People who equated net worth with human worth, and who used their privilege not as a tool for good, but as a wall to keep the rest of the world out. He had always been on the other side of the blueprints, the quiet professional whose brilliance they paid for, but whose humanity they never saw. Today, however, was different. Today, he wasn't just a visitor. He was the owner. He had signed the final papers 3 days ago, the culmination of a silent, multi-million-dollar acquisition conducted through a discreet holding company. Mr. Abernathy, the club's aging founder, had been eager to sell to someone who would preserve the club's beauty but dismantle its toxic culture. David was that someone. But the Van Cess, in their blissful ignorance, were about to provide him with the perfect, undeniable justification for the sweeping changes he intended to make. The pool area was a carefully curated tableau of casual wealth. Perfectly spaced lounge chairs sat under wide canvas umbrellas, attended to by a staff that moved with quiet, almost invisible efficiency. The air smelled of chlorine and expensive sunscreen. Leo, oblivious to the undercurrents of social calculus, spotted Ethan immediately and ran to greet his friend, their youthful enthusiasm a splash of vibrant color in a muted landscape. David found a pair of empty chairs slightly away from the main cluster, setting down their bag. He watched Leo and Ethan cannonball into the pool, their laughter echoing across the water. For a moment, a genuine smile touched his lips. This was why he was here. For his son. It wasn't long before Eleanor glided over, a silk wrap draped artfully over her swimsuit. She didn't sit, but stood over him, casting a literal and figurative shadow. "I do hope your son knows the rules," she began, her voice low and conspiratorial, as if she were doing him a great favor by imparting this wisdom. "No running, no excessive splashing. We value a certain decorum here at Oakwood. He's a good kid. He knows how to behave," David said calmly, his eyes still on the pool. He refused to be baited, refused to let her see any flicker of annoyance. His composure was his shield. "Of course," she said, though her tone implied the opposite. "It's just that our guest policy is quite strict. We have to be so careful about maintaining standards. You understand," the words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "You are a guest. You're temporary. You're not one of us." David finally turned his gaze from the pool to meet hers. He held her look, his expression unreadable. "I understand completely, Eleanor. Standards are incredibly important." His directness and use of her first name seemed to throw her. She had expected deference, perhaps a touch of intimidation. Instead, she found a quiet confidence that was more unsettling than any outburst would have been. She was accustomed to people who were either part of her world or visibly impressed by it. David was neither, and it was unnerving. Just then, Richard Vance arrived, a thick, imposing man with a florid face and a gold watch that gleamed in the sun. He clapped a heavy hand on his wife's shoulder, his eyes immediately landing on David. "Everything all right here, my dear?" he boomed, his voice carrying an automatic assumption of authority. "Just acquainting Mr. Harris with our customs," Eleanor said, recovering her poise. Richard grunted, his eyes performing the same swift, dismissive inventory his wife's had earlier. "Right, Harris, you're Ethan's friend's father." He gestured vaguely toward David's simple attire. "Casual Friday?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. It was a petty jab, meant to highlight the difference between David's understated elegance and his own loud, logo-emblazoned resort wear. David simply smiled. "Something like that. I prefer to be comfortable." In his bag, nestled between a towel and a novel, was a worn, leather-bound journal. Inside were his architectural sketches, notes on his company's latest projects, but also in the back his initial thoughts for the Oakwood renovation. He had written down his late wife Sarah's words from years ago, on one of their first dates when they'd picnicked just outside the club's fences, unable to go in. "A place this beautiful," she had said, "shouldn't be so ugly on the inside." He'd bought the club to honor that memory, to transform it into the beautiful place, inside and out, that she had imagined. He subtly touched the corner of the journal through the canvas of the bag. This was his symbolic object, the repository of his purpose. The Van Cess petty insults were like stones thrown at a fortress. They made noise, but they couldn't breach the walls. "Comfort," Richard scoffed, as if the word were a foreign concept. "Comfort is knowing your grandfather's name is on the founder's plaque in the lobby. That's comfort." He turned to his wife. "Come, darling. Let's get a drink. I'm sure Mr. Harris is capable of watching the boys." With that, they swept away, a royal couple leaving a commoner in their wake. David watched them go, not with anger, but with a profound sense of clarity. He wasn't just going to renovate the clubhouse and update the golf course. He was going to perform a cultural exorcism, and the Van Cess had just volunteered to be the first ghost to go. The water in the pool shimmered, and for a moment, David saw his wife's smiling face reflected in its surface. "We're going to fix it, Sarah," he whispered to himself. "We're going to make it beautiful on the inside, too." The afternoon wore on, a slow-burn exercise in social stratification. When the boys got hungry, the Van Cess led the way to the dining terrace, a sprawling stone patio overlooking the 18th green. The hierarchy was immediately apparent. The Van Cess were given the best table without asking, a prime spot shaded by a massive oak tree. David and Leo were seated with them, but it was clear they were accessories, not participants. Richard and Eleanor spoke to each other and to a few other members who stopped by their table. Their conversation a loud tapestry of brand names, exotic travel destinations, and club politics. They talked about their new yacht, their summer plans for the Hamptons, and the disgraceful drop in quality of the club's catering service. David was pointedly ignored. They didn't so much exclude him as act, as if he weren't there at all, a ghost at their feast. He didn't mind. It gave him an opportunity to observe, to listen. He heard the casual entitlement in their voices, the way they spoke about the staff, as if they were pieces of furniture, the deep-seated belief that their membership fees bought them not just access, but ownership of the people and the place itself. He made mental notes, his architect's mind cataloging the structural flaws not in the building, but in its culture. Leo, meanwhile, was having the time of his life. He and Ethan were giggling over a plate of fries, their friendship a pure, uncomplicated thing that stood in stark contrast to the brittle social games of their parents. David focused on his son, his heart filled with a fierce, protective love. He would let Leo enjoy this day, this bubble of childhood innocence, for as long as he could. The adult world, with all its ugliness, could wait. While Richard was pontificating about the stock market, David's phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. He discreetly pulled it out. It was a text from his financial advisor, a man named Gene, who was as meticulous as he was discreet. The message was short and simple. Final transfer complete. Oakwood Reserve Holdings LLC is now fully capitalized. All assets are under your control. Congratulations, David. It's all yours. A slow, subtle smile spread across David's face. He typed a quick reply. "Thank you, Gene. Phase 1 is complete." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. The finality of it settled over him, a quiet, powerful weight. He owned the ground they were sitting on. He owned the table, the chairs, the silverware Richard was using to gesticulate wildly as he spoke. He owned the salaries of the waiters who scurried to refill their glasses. The dramatic irony was so thick he could almost taste it. "Something amusing, Harris?" Richard asked, noticing David smile. His tone was sharp, suspicious, as if David had no right to find joy in his presence. "Just a good piece of news from the office," David said smoothly. "A project I've been working on for a long time just came together." "Umph," Richard grunted, already losing interest. "Well, some of us have to work for a living, I suppose. Not all of us had grandfathers who were smart enough to buy land when it was cheap." He laughed, a self-congratulatory bark that Eleanor dutifully echoed. It was a barb meant to put David in his place, to remind him of his status as an outsider, a worker bee in a world of queen bees and kings. The insult slid off David like water off stone. He knew the truth of his success. He hadn't inherited it. He had built it. He had started his architectural firm from a small room above a garage, working 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and a relentless belief in his own vision. He had earned every penny, every contract, every bit of respect in his field through talent and integrity. Richard Vance, who had inherited his wealth and his membership, couldn't possibly comprehend the depth of satisfaction that came from building something with your own two hands. David thought again of his wife. Sarah had been his biggest champion. When he was exhausted and full of doubt, she was the one who would bring him tea at 2 a.m. and trace the lines of his blueprints, telling him they were works of art. "You don't just build buildings, David," she used to say. "You build futures." He had bought this club not as a trophy, but as another project. A place to build a better future for his son and for other families like his. A place where a child's laughter wouldn't be judged on the size of his father's bank account. This was Sarah's legacy as much as it was his. He was simply the architect, executing her vision of a more beautiful world. The Van Cess and their petty cruelties were nothing more than demolition work that needed to be done before the real construction could begin. The quiet satisfaction of the text message settled into a calm resolve. Phase 1 was complete. It was almost time for Phase 2. The afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. The boys, re-energized by their lunch, had found a soccer ball and were kicking it back and forth on a stretch of unused grass near the terrace. Their movements were joyful and clumsy, a whirlwind of flailing limbs and happy shouts. David watched them with a fond smile, appreciating the simple, unvarnished energy of childhood. Most of the other members paid them no mind, lost in their own conversations and cocktails. But Eleanor Vance's eyes were fixed on them, her gaze sharp and critical, as if she were just waiting for a transgression. It came, as minor mishaps often do, in a moment of overexuberant play. Leo, trying to pass the ball back to Ethan, put a little too much force behind the kick. The ball sailed past Ethan, bounced once on the grass, and then gently toppled a small, ornamental lantern that sat at the edge of a flower bed. The lantern, made of thin metal and glass, tipped onto the soft turf with a quiet clink. It didn't break. It didn't even scratch. It was a non-event, a tiny blip in an otherwise perfect afternoon. But for Eleanor, it was the moment she had been waiting for. She shot to her feet, a gasp of theatrical horror escaping her lips. "Oh my goodness! Richard, did you see that?" Richard, who had been deep in a story about his golf handicap, looked up, his face instantly darkening. What in God's name was that? Eleanor pointed a trembling finger toward the toppled lantern. "That boy, your son," she screeched, turning on David. "He's completely out of control. Look what he's done." The sudden outburst drew the attention of everyone on the terrace. Conversations paused. Heads turned. David felt a wave of hostile scrutiny wash over him. He saw Leo freeze, the joy draining from his face to be replaced by fear and confusion. David's own protective instincts flared, hot and sharp, but he kept his expression calm, his movements deliberate. He stood up and started walking toward his son. "He's destroyed it," Eleanor continued, her voice rising in pitch. "That lantern is a priceless antique. It's been in my husband's family for generations." This was, David knew instantly, a blatant lie. The lantern was a cheap, mass-produced piece of garden decor, the kind you could buy at any home improvement store. He had noticed them on his initial walkthrough with Mr. Abernathy, who had mentioned they'd been installed last summer as part of a minor landscaping update. The lie was so audacious, so transparently designed to create a scene that it was almost pathetic. Richard stormed over to the flower bed, his face purple with manufactured rage. He picked up the lantern, inspecting it as if it were the Fabergé egg. "This is unacceptable," he boomed, turning to David, who had now reached Leo's side and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Completely unacceptable. You will pay for these damages immediately, and you need to learn to control your son. This is a place of refinement, not a public playground." "Dad, I'm sorry," Leo whispered, his lower lip trembling. "I didn't mean to." "I know you didn't, buddy. It was an accident," David said softly, his voice meant only for his son. Then he looked up at Richard, his gaze steady and cool. "It was a minor accident. The lantern isn't even damaged." "Not damaged," Richard scoffed, holding it up for all to see. "The disrespect is the damage. The lack of breeding is the damage." The situation had escalated far beyond a tipped-over piece of tin. It was now a public trial, and David and his son were the accused. "Mr. Henderson," Richard bellowed, spotting the club manager hovering nervously at the edge of the terrace. "Get over here." Mr. Henderson, a man whose spine seemed to be made of jelly, scurried over. He was in his late 50s, with a permanent look of anxiety etched onto his face. He was a man caught in the middle, his livelihood dependent on placating wealthy and powerful members like the Vances. Yes, Mr. Vance? Is there a problem? A problem? Richard laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. This man's son has just destroyed a valuable piece of club property, and he refuses to take responsibility. I want him to pay for it, and then I want them gone. All eyes turned to Mr. Henderson. He looked from Richard's furious face to David's calm, waiting expression. He was a deer in the headlights. The path of least resistance was clear. Siding with the Vances was the safe, easy choice. Sir, he began, turning to David, his voice weak and apologetic. Mr. Vance is one of our most distinguished members. If he says there's damage, then perhaps it would be best if you just took care of the matter. It was a moment of profound cowardice. Henderson had abdicated his responsibility, allowing a bully to dictate the rules. And in that moment, David's patience, which had been stretched thin all day, finally snapped. It wasn't the insults to him or the lies about the lantern. It was the sight of his son, standing small and scared, being publicly humiliated for a simple childhood mistake. It was the sight of a man in a position of authority folding like a cheap suit in the face of arrogance. This was the disease that infected Oakwood Reserve, and David was the cure. He had seen enough. The time for quiet observation was over. The time for action had arrived. He met Mr. Henderson's wavering gaze, and for the first time that day, he let a sliver of the steel beneath his calm, exterior show. The manager flinched, as if he'd touched a live wire. The quiet before the storm had just ended. Richard Vance, puffed up with his victory over the spineless club manager, crossed his arms and adopted the posture of a judge delivering a final verdict. So, the matter is settled, he declared, his voice resonating across the now silent terrace. You'll settle the bill with Mr. Henderson on your way out. And I think it's time for you and your son to leave. People like you simply don't belong here. The phrase hung in the air, a poisoned dart. People like you. The culmination of every sneer, every condescending glance, every whispered insinuation from the entire day, all distilled into 3 ugly words. Leo flinched as if he'd been struck, and David felt a surge of cold, focused anger. He knelt for a moment, turning his back on the Vances to face his son. Leo, he said, his voice soft but firm, I want you to go wait with Ethan over by the putting green. This is a conversation for the adults. It's okay. I'll be there in a minute. Leo looked at his father, saw the unwavering strength in his eyes, and nodded. He gave his friend Ethan, who looked just as confused, a small wave, and the 2 boys retreated to a safe distance. Once Leo was out of earshot, David stood up slowly. The air around him seemed to shift. The easygoing, polite guest was gone, replaced by someone else entirely. His posture straightened, his shoulders squared, and a quiet authority settled over him like a cloak. He met Richard's smug gaze, and his voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. People like me, he repeated, the question dangerously soft. Please, Richard, enlighten me. What kind of people are we? Richard was taken aback. He had expected a mumbled apology, a hasty retreat. He had not expected a challenge. You know exactly what I mean, he blustered, his confidence wavering for the first time. People who don't understand the rules. People who don't respect property. No, I don't think that's what you mean, David said, taking a deliberate step forward. The space between them crackled with tension. Let's be clear. Let's catalog the afternoon, shall we? He began to tick off the points on his fingers, his voice calm and methodical, a litany of their petty transgressions. This was his list of grievances. First, your wife implied my car was a service vehicle. Then, she lectured me on standards as if I were a child. You, Richard, made a joke about my clothes. You both spent the entire lunch pointedly ignoring me while loudly broadcasting your wealth. And now, you've manufactured a ridiculous drama over a $50 garden lantern, terrified my son, and publicly demanded I be thrown out. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. This has nothing to do with rules or property. You've been uncomfortable since the moment I arrived. The question is why. The directness of the confrontation stunned the Vances. People in their world didn't speak like this. They communicated in a coded language of insinuation and passive aggression. This was a verbal chess match, and David had just swept half of Richard's pieces off the board. Eleanor stepped forward, her hand on her husband's arm. "Now, see here," she began, her voice trembling with indignation. "You are a guest in our club. Is it your club, Eleanor?" David interrupted, his gaze shifting to her. His tone was still quiet, but it held an unmistakable edge of command. "Do you own it? Or are you just a member? A member who, I might add, seems to believe that her annual dues purchase the right to humiliate anyone she deems beneath her." Richard's face was now a dangerous shade of crimson. He was a man whose entire identity was built on a foundation of unchallenged authority. To have that authority questioned, dismantled by this nobody was intolerable. "That's it," he roared, jabbing his finger at David again. "I've had enough of your insolence. This club has been in my family for 3 generations. We are the foundation of this place. Henderson, call security. I want him removed. Now." David didn't even glance at the terrified manager. His eyes remained locked on Richard. A small, sad smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a man who held all the cards, watching his opponent make a final, desperate, and completely futile move. "That's where you're mistaken, Richard," he said, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper, a quiet bomb that was about to detonate their entire world. "Your family were members. Valued members once. But you don't own this club." He paused for a beat, savoring the moment of pure, undiluted dramatic irony. "Edo." The statement landed. Simple, devastating, final. For a moment, there was absolute silence on the terrace, broken only by the distant chirp of a bird. The members who had been watching the drama unfold stared, their minds struggling to process what they had just heard. Then, Richard let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It was a brittle, unconvincing sound. You own Oakwood? That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard. You probably couldn't even afford the initiation fee." Eleanor joined in, a high-pitched, nervous titter. "The man is delusional, Richard. He's clearly lost his mind. Mr. Henderson, are you going to call security or not?" Mr. Henderson looked back and forth between the two men, his face a mess of confusion and fear. He saw the Van Cess, the pillars of the club, the source of so much of its revenue and his own personal stress. And he saw David, a man who stood with an unnerving, almost regal calm, a man who had just made an impossible claim with absolute certainty. David saw the man's indecision, the war between his instinct for self-preservation and the dawning suspicion that he was about to make a catastrophic mistake. David decided to end his suffering. He turned his attention to the manager, his voice softening slightly, a gesture of mercy. "Mr. Henderson, there's no need to call security, but I would like you to make a phone call for me." He paused, letting the instructions sink in. "Could you please call Mr. Abernathy? He's in the Founders Lounge. He told me he'd be waiting for my call." The name Abernathy landed with the force of a physical blow. James Abernathy was the club's founder and owner, a reclusive, almost mythical figure who hadn't been seen at a regular club event in years. He was the ultimate authority, the final word. The Van Cess exchanged a flicker of an uncertain glance. It was a bluff. It had to be a bluff. Mr. Henderson swallowed hard. "Mr. Abernathy, sir? I don't know if he's there," David said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Tell him David Harris needs to see him on the terrace. Now, please." The manager, propelled by the sheer force of David's will, scurried away, fumbling for his phone. A tense, uncertain silence descended once more. Richard tried to regain his footing. "A pathetic little gambit," he sneered, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Dropping Mr. Abernathy's name won't save you." David didn't reply. He simply waited. He knew, with the calm certainty of an architect reviewing a finished blueprint, exactly what was about to happen. A minute passed, then another. Then the doors to the clubhouse slid open, and a figure emerged. It was James Abernathy. He was an old man, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, his frame frail beneath an impeccably tailored tweed jacket. But his eyes, as they scanned the crowd, were as sharp and clear as a winter sky. A murmur went through the assembled members. The king had returned to his castle. Richard and Eleanor straightened up, their faces instantly rearranging into expressions of fawning respect. "Mr. Abernathy, one unexpected pleasure," Richard began, taking a step toward him. But Mr. Abernathy's eyes weren't on him. They swept past the Van Cess as if they were invisible, landing directly on David. A warm, genuine smile transformed the old man's stern features. He walked, with a slow but steady gait, across the stone patio. He bypassed Richard completely, stopping directly in front of David. He extended a frail, trembling hand. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice raspy but clear and loud enough for everyone to hear. "David, a pleasure to see you. I trust the handover has been smooth." David took the offered hand, his grip firm and respectful. "It has been very illuminating, James," he replied, a world of meaning in his words. The Van Cess faces had drained of all color. Richard stared at the handshake, his jaw slack, his mind refusing to connect the dots. "Abernathy, James, what is this?" he stammered, his voice a pathetic croak. "Who is this man?" Mr. Abernathy finally turned to look at Richard, and the warmth in his eyes was replaced by an arctic frost of disappointment. "This man, Richard," he said, his voice turning to steel, "is David Harris, the brilliant architect behind the new museum downtown and the visionary who will be leading this club into the future." He paused, letting the weight of his next words crush them completely. "He is the new owner of Oakwood Reserve. And I suggest," he finished, his gaze sweeping over Richard and Eleanor, "you start showing him the respect that position commands. The quiet bomb had detonated, and the shockwave flattened everything in its path." The aftermath of the revelation was a study in shattered realities. The world had been turned upside down, and the Van Cess were in freefall. Eleanor looked as though she might faint, her hand flying to her chest in a gesture of pure, melodramatic shock. Richard's face was a grotesque mask of disbelief, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air. The smug confidence that had been his defining characteristic was gone, stripped away to reveal the terrified, insecure man beneath. The other members on the terrace were frozen, their expressions ranging from stunned surprise to a dawning, delicious schadenfreude. The Van Cess reign of terror was apparently over. David, however, did not revel in their collapse. His victory was not in their humiliation, but in the restoration of decency. His first move was not to lord his new power over his tormentors, but to turn his back on them completely. He walked over to where Leo and Ethan were standing, their young faces a mixture of confusion and concern. He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with his son. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Leo nodded, though his eyes were wide. "Dad, what's happening? Who is that old man?" "That's Mr. Abernathy," David explained calmly. "He's a friend, and he just helped me sort out a misunderstanding with Mr. and Mrs. Vance. Everything is going to be fine now." He pulled Leo into a hug, a solid, reassuring embrace that communicated what words could not. "You are safe. I am here. I will always protect you." This simple act of fatherly love, performed in the crucible of his triumph, was a powerful statement. It showed everyone watching, the Van Cess, the members, the staff, where his true priorities lay. He wasn't a corporate raider or a vengeful tycoon. He was a father first. Only after ensuring his son was okay did he stand and turn back to face the wreckage. The Van Cess were still standing there, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their miscalculation. Mr. Abernathy had retreated to a nearby table, observing with a grimly satisfied expression. The stage now belonged entirely to David. He walked toward the Van Cess, his steps unhurried and deliberate. His tone, when he finally spoke, was not triumphant or angry. It was filled with a profound and weary disappointment. "This place," he said, his gesture encompassing the lush greens, the sparkling pool, the stately clubhouse, was meant to be his sanctuary. Mr. Abernathy built it to be a place for families to connect, for people to find peace and recreation. A community. He looked from Richard to Eleanor, his gaze pinning them in place. But you, and people like you, have turned it into your personal fiefdom. You've used it as a stage for your vanity, a place to measure your worth by excluding others. You don't see a community. You see a hierarchy. And you were desperate to make sure I knew my place was at the bottom. Eleanor, finally finding her voice, took a stumbling step forward. Her entire demeanor had changed. The haughty arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading subservience. We're so sorry, she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. We didn't know. It was all a terrible misunderstanding. David's expression hardened slightly. He would not grant her that easy escape. Was it a misunderstanding, Eleanor? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. This was the moral mirror, forcing her to confront the ugliness of her own reflection. Or did you see a black man with his son, driving a modest car and wearing simple clothes, and make a series of assumptions? You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with basic human decency. But you chose not to. You didn't know I was the owner, but you knew exactly who you were. And you chose to be cruel. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a choice. The truth of his words hung in the air, irrefutable. There was no defense. Eleanor flinched and looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Richard, however, still had a flicker of his old arrogance. Now, listen here, he started, his voice a blustering attempt to regain control. There's no need to. Richard, David cut him off, his voice flat and final. Be quiet, the simple command, delivered with absolute authority, silenced him instantly. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been completely and irrevocably inverted. The man they had tried to expel was now their judge, jury, and executioner. The consequences began to unfold with methodical precision. David first turned his attention to the club manager, who was still hovering nearby, looking as if he wished the earth would swallow him whole. Mr. Henderson, David said, his tone businesslike. Henderson flinched, expecting to be fired on the spot. You were placed in a difficult position today, and you failed. You failed to uphold the club's integrity, and you failed to protect a guest and his child from harassment. Mr. Harris, I am so sorry David held up a hand, stopping him. Apologies are not enough. Actions are what matter. So now you have a choice. He paused, letting the manager absorb the gravity of the moment. You can continue to manage a club that serves the egos of a select few, cowering every time a man like Richard Vance raises his voice. Or you can stay and help me build a club that serves the entire community of its members, a place where dignity and respect are the most important rules. The choice is yours. But if you stay, know this. Your first loyalty is to the principles of this club, not to the wallets of its wealthiest members. Never again will you stand by while someone is mistreated on this property. Am I clear? Tears of shame and relief welled in Mr. Henderson's eyes. He had been offered not just a job, but a chance at redemption. Yes, Mr. Harris, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Crystal clear. Thank you. I won't let you down. Good, David said with a crisp nod. He then turned his gaze back to the Vances, who watched the exchange with growing dread. Their fate was next. As for you, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, your membership and the legacy your grandfather helped build is now under review. He didn't expel them. That would have been too simple, too clean. Expulsion would make them martyrs in their own minds. Instead, he sentenced them to something far worse for people so obsessed with status, uncertainty. For the next 6 months, you will be on probationary status, he announced, his voice carrying across the terrace. Your access will be limited. Your behavior will be monitored. You will be, for the first time in your lives, guests here. And you will be expected to earn your place back in this community through your actions, not your name. He then delivered the final, humiliating blow. He gestured to the small, insignificant lantern that had started the whole affair. And Richard, he said, a hint of ice in his tone, Mr. Henderson will be sending you a bill for the damages. I had our groundskeeper confirm the model. It's a sun-bright solar pathway lantern. You can find them at Home Depot for $49.99. Be sure to pay it promptly. The absurdity of it, the sheer pettiness of their manufactured outrage laid bare for all to see, was more damning than any tirade. A ripple of stifled laughter went through the crowd of onlookers. The Van Cess, once the titans of the terrace, had been reduced to a pathetic joke. Their power, built on a foundation of illusion and intimidation, had crumbled to dust. 3 months later, the autumn air carried a new feeling across the grounds of Oakwood Reserve, a feeling of lightness, of inclusivity. The oppressive, judgmental atmosphere that had once suffocated the club was gone, replaced by a genuine sense of community. The changes David Harris had implemented were not merely cosmetic. They were foundational. The club's mission statement, once a dusty plaque in the lobby, had been rewritten and now spoke of dignity, respect, and community for all, and they were not just words. A scholarship program, funded by a portion of the club's profits, had been established, granting membership to a dozen families from the community who would never have been able to afford it. The sight of their children from all backgrounds, laughing and playing on the lawns that were once the exclusive domain of the privileged few, was a constant, joyous testament to the new era. The stuffy, black-tie galas of the past have been replaced with family movie nights on the lawn, community barbecues, and workshops open to all members, from junior golf clinics to art classes. David had transformed Oakwood from a fortress of exclusion into a hub of connection. He was not a distant, unseen owner. He was a presence. Members would see him on Saturday mornings, not in a suit, but in jeans and a sweatshirt, helping Leo with his golf swing. He knew the staff by their first names, asking about their families, listening to their suggestions for improving the club. He had lunch on the terrace, not at a reserved table, but wherever there was an empty seat, striking up conversations with members old and new. His leadership was quiet, humble, and profoundly effective. He was, as his late wife had always known, not just building a place, but building a future. The Van Cess were still there, ghosts of the old regime. David had been true to his word. Their membership had not been revoked, but their status had been annihilated. The social currency they had once wielded with such arrogance was now worthless. Other members, many of whom had long chafed under the Van Cess snobbery, but had been too intimidated to say anything, now felt emboldened. They no longer laughed at Richard's loud jokes or rushed to compliment Eleanor's new dress. Instead, the Van Cess were often met with polite, cool silence. They were socially isolated, forced to watch as the club they once dominated thrived on the very principles of inclusivity they had so despised. It was a poetic justice more potent than any outright punishment. They were forced to witness the world moving on without them, their outdated values rendered obsolete. One crisp October afternoon, as David was reviewing some new landscaping plans with Mr. Henderson near the 18th hole, he saw Richard Vance approaching. He was alone, and he walked with a hesitation David had never seen in him before. The confident, booming stride was gone, replaced by the uncertain shuffle of a man who was no longer sure of his footing. "Mr. Harris," Richard said, his voice quiet, almost timid. "David, do you have a moment?" David nodded, gesturing for Mr. Henderson to give them some privacy. "Richard, what can I do for you?" Richard stared at the ground for a long moment, struggling to find the words. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a shame that looked genuine. I wanted to apologize," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "Properly this time. Not because you're the owner, and not because I'm trying to get back in your good graces." He took a deep breath. "I'm apologizing because I was wrong. What I did that day, how I treated you and your son. There's no excuse for it. I was arrogant. I was a bully. I was a fool." He looked away, toward the families picnicking on the lawn. "I see what you're building here. It's a better place. A much better place than the one I was trying so hard to protect." He met David's eyes again. "I am truly sorry." It was the apology David had never expected to receive. It was not a desperate plea for forgiveness, but a humble admission of fault. He saw in Richard's eyes not the arrogant elitist from 3 months ago, but a man who had been stripped of his false pride and forced to look at his own character for the first time. Redemption, David knew, was a long and difficult road, but it had to start somewhere. It had to start with a moment of genuine self-awareness. David considered the man before him. He could have rejected the apology, held the grudge, and enjoyed his continued dominance. But that was the way of the old Oakwood. That was the way of Richard Vance. It was not his way. "Thank you, Richard," David said simply, his voice even. "I appreciate that." He extended his hand. Apology accepted. Richard looked at the offered hand, his eyes widening in surprise. He took it, his grip firm. It was not a handshake between owner and member or victor and vanquished. It was a handshake between two men. A small, quiet moment of grace on a fall afternoon, a sign that even the most toxic ground could, with time and effort, be made fertile again. The last rays of the evening sun filtered through the leaves of the great oak tree, dappling the grass in gold. David and Leo sat beneath its sprawling branches, the same tree that shaded the dining terrace where the confrontation had taken place months ago. Now it felt different. It felt like their tree. From their vantage point, they could see the whole sweep of the club. Families packing up their picnic baskets, teenagers finishing a game of tennis, the warm lights of the clubhouse beginning to glow against the twilight sky. The air was filled with the gentle murmur of conversation and the distant sound of children's laughter. It was peaceful. It was whole. Leo leaned his head against his father's shoulder, a comfortable, familiar weight. "You know, Ethan said his dad is different now," Leo said, his voice thoughtful. "He said he's quieter, and he listens more." David smiled, putting an arm around his son. "Sometimes people just need a chance to see things differently, buddy. Sometimes they just need to learn a new way to be." He looked out at the community he was building and reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He hadn't sought revenge on the Van Cess. He had sought justice. He hadn't wanted to punish them. He had wanted to teach them. His actions had never been about tearing something down, but about building something better in its place. He had learned from his wife, Sarah, that the strongest structures weren't built on foundations of exclusion and fear, but on pillars of empathy and respect. True power, he now understood more deeply than ever, wasn't the ability to keep people out, but the strength to invite them in. It wasn't about the height of your walls, but the width of your gate. Wealth and status were just tools. You could use them to build a monument to your own ego, a cold and empty fortress like the one the Van Cess had inhabited. Or you could use them to lay the groundwork for a community, a vibrant and welcoming space where everyone felt they belonged. The real measure of a person's worth, he thought, wasn't in their title or their bank balance. It wasn't in what you owned or the clubs you belonged to. It was in how you treated people, especially when you believed no one of consequence was watching. It was in the dignity you afforded others, regardless of their perceived station. That was the true currency. That was the only legacy that truly mattered. He thought of the Van Cess, humbled and learning. He thought of Mr. Henderson, now a proud and proactive manager. He thought of the new families who now called this place their weekend home. He had bought a country club, but in the process, he had created a neighborhood. He squeezed Leo's shoulder. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go home." As they walked across the darkening lawn, hand in hand, David felt a profound sense of peace. The renovation of Oakwood Reserve was well underway, and the foundation was strong, true, and built to last. David Harris taught the Van Cess and the entire community of Oakwood a lesson they would never forget, that a person's value is etched in their character, not their credentials. He showed them that true strength is quiet, true leadership is humble, and true wealth is measured in the positive impact you have on the lives of others. What do you think is the most important quality in a leader? Is it strength, compassion, or integrity? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for joining us for this story of justice and redemption. If it resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more stories that uplift and inspire. We'll see you next time.